Today, we're going to be talking about the story of a girl named Mary Bell. Mary Bell was born in Corbridge, England, and raised by her mother, who was a well-known local prostitute, while her father's identity has never been confirmed. As a child, she was severely neglected, and often an afterthought to her mother. It is even said that after her mother gave birth to her in the hospital, she declined to hold Mary, even shouting at the hospital staff, "Take the thing away from me." Throughout most of her childhood, Mary was plagued with many injuries caused by household accidents. This led many to believe she suffered abuse at the hands of her mother. On one occasion, Mary's mother actually sold her to a mentally unstable woman who couldn't have children of her own. This resulted in her older sister having to drive hours to bring Mary back to her home. Because of her traumatic upbringing, Mary exhibited many disturbing and unpredictable behaviors, which included traumatic mood swings and chronic bedwetting. At school, she was known to get in many physical fights, both with boys and girls, and she would attempt to end those fights with strangulation. Almost all of her classmates became aware to stay away from Mary, unless they wanted trouble. That was, except for one girl. Mary's next-door neighbor, Norma Bell, though they share the last name, they are not related, became very close to Mary, and after a while, they were each other's only friends. Norma joined in on many of the schoolyard fights. After many of these fights, Mary's classmates started to recognize her behavior. They knew when she was about to become violent, as she would start shaking her head violently and staring intently at whoever was about to receive her rage. At this point, her classmates would be running, their hearts racing, and not quite knowing what to expect. The first real attack happened in Scotswood, England, as concerned citizens found a small 3-year-old boy wandering the streets in a daze with blood running down his face. After police arrived and were able to calm the boy down, he informed them he had been playing with 2 girls named Mary and Norma Bell at an abandoned shelter. They had made their way to the roof when the boy suddenly felt 2 hands push against his back and sent him tumbling 7 feet down to his head concussively hitting the ground, leaving him with a severe laceration to the head. Later that day, police showed up at the girls' houses and questioned them about the incident, but both girls claimed they found the boy bloodied on the ground at the shelter, not knowing how he got there. Police notified local authorities, but since both girls were underage, they were let off with a warning. The first murder happened one day before Mary's 11th birthday. Mary and a young boy named Martin Brown were out exploring and found an old abandoned house. The 2 children ventured inside and started checking the place out. They made their way upstairs, and once they entered the master bedroom, no one is quite sure what happened. But later that day, 3 different children decided to explore the same house, and when they made their way up to the bedroom, they were horrified by what they saw. In front of them lay the dead body of a young boy, specks of blood and foam around his mouth. But other than that, there were no signs of obvious death. An adult happened to be passing by and attempted to perform CPR on the boy, but to no avail. After the authorities were able to perform an autopsy, they still had no clear cause of death. The next day, on Mary's 11th birthday, her and Norma decided to break into a nearby nursery. Once they made their way into the nursery, they proceeded to completely decimate the building by flipping desks, tearing up books, and smearing paint all over the property. The next day, employees of the nursery noticed the break-in, so they called law enforcement. Once officers arrived on scene, they found that notes had been hastily left about the scene. One of the notes proclaimed, "We did murder Martin Brown," but the most disturbing note said something much different. It read, "I murder so that I may come back." The police weren't exactly sure what any of it meant, and chalked it up to a childish prank. The next day, the mother of the deceased boy received a phone call from Mary, asking if she could see her son. She informed Mary through tears that her son had passed, but Mary responded by saying, "I know he's dead. I want to see him in his coffin." The second murder happened about a year after the first incident. A 3-year-old boy named Howe was last seen by his parents playing outside of his house with Mary and Norma Bell. After the boy did not return later that night, the family became concerned, and with the help of the neighborhood, they started to search for the boy. After a couple hours, the boy's body was discovered, slightly hidden by clumps of grass and weeds. It was obvious through the color of the boy's lips that he had been strangled, as they were a distorted blue color. His neck also had clear physical trauma. This time, the autopsy confirmed the boy had died by strangulation. But those weren't the only injuries the boy received. The coroner also noted that a crudely drawn M had been carved into the boy's stomach. Due to the nature of the crime, the police believe Brian had been murdered by another child. Due to this, over 1,200 children were questioned as to their whereabouts on the day of the murder. Two of the children that were interviewed were Mary and Norma Bell, who witnesses had seen playing with Brian shortly before he went missing. When Mary and Norma were first questioned, they both denied any involvement with the murder, but admitted to playing with Brian that day. In a subsequent interview, Mary informed the detective she had seen an older boy playing with Brian just moments before he was murdered. She said the older boy had a pair of broken scissors with him. That statement confirmed to the detective that Mary was their suspect, as the police were the only ones that knew of a broken pair of scissors were used in the murder. But nonetheless, Mary and Norma were released to the custody of their parents. Soon after Norma returned home, her parents contacted the police and informed them that their daughter would like to talk to them about the murder of Brian Howe. Norma proceeded to tell the detective that on the day of the murder, Mary invited her to go for a walk, where she then showed Norma the body of Brian and demonstrated how she had strangled him. Mary then told Norma how much she enjoyed strangling the boy and how she stabbed him with a pair of broken scissors. After Norma's description to the detective, she led him to the actual crime scene, which completely confirmed her story to the detective. With all of this new information, the detective decided to have a second talk with Mary. On this occasion, Mary was much more defensive, and even accused the detective of trying to brainwash her, and then proceeded to end the interview. The detective decided to re-interview Norma, where she fully confessed and admitted to being present when the crime took place. This was all the detective needed. Both girls were formally charged with murder later that evening. Mary responded to her arrest by saying, "That's all right by me." Once the girls were in custody, they both blamed each other for the murder, but they also admitted to breaking into the nursery, and Mary admitted to writing the notes found at the scene. This was enough for police to also charge the two girls with the murder of Martin Brown. Shortly after this, both girls underwent a psychological evaluation, where Norma was revealed to be intellectually delayed, and Mary was revealed to be a bright, cunning young girl. The doctors concluded that Mary did not suffer from a mental disorder, but from a psychopathic personality disorder. The doctor is quoted as saying, "Mary's social techniques are primitive and take the form of automatic denial, ingratiation, manipulation, complaining, bullying, flight, or violence." In the preceding trial, it was argued by the prosecutors that both Mary and Norma acted together to commit the two murders. Both entered a not guilty plea. Prosecutors alleged that the girls killed solely for the pleasure and excitement of murder, and that both girls well knew what they did was wrong and what the results would be. The trial lasted in total only 9 days, with it resulting in Mary being cleared for murder, but convicted of manslaughter of the two boys under the grounds of diminished responsibility. Norma Bell was acquitted of all charges. Mary was sentenced to serve an undetermined amount of time, but the twists don't end here. After being in prison for almost 7 years, Mary and another inmate successfully escaped from prison. By the time she was found, she had already dyed her hair blonde in an attempt to mask her identity. Bell only lost prison privileges for 28 days as punishment. In May of 1980, at the young age of 23, Mary Bell was officially released from prison. 2 years later, she had a daughter. Since then, not much is known about Mary's life, as she's protected by an anonymity order. To this day, no one knows the true motivation behind Mary Bell's two murders.